What did Priestley get wrong about his character of Eva Smith? Let's find out. Hi there, I'm Giles Goff. I'm an education writer and a recovering English teacher, and today we're looking at the construct that is Eva Smith. Let's get into it. So she starts off as a worker in Mr Birling's factory. She leads an unsuccessful strike, resulting in her getting fired. This is in 1911. She gets a job in a fashionable clothing shop around December 1911, only to be fired because Sheila made a complaint about her. At this point, she turns to prostitution and she begins a short-lived affair with Gerald Croft. It's not ever at any point suggested that Gerald Croft is one of her clients, as it were, but the two things happen very closely together. She gets pregnant by Eric Birling. This is at the point where she has a very short-lived relationship with Eric as well. It doesn't sound like it's as loving as it is with Gerald, and Eric starts stealing money from Birling and company to give to Eva. When she finds out that the money is stolen, she refuses to take it. She applies to Mrs Birling's charity for sort of women in need, and she's refused aid by Mrs Birling, who sees her as impertinent. And lastly, she kills herself by drinking bleach, and this is all prologue effectively, because this is all happens before the play starts, and then we learn about it throughout the course of the play. Now, an important note before we get started. This is not really a play about suicide. What do I mean by that? Well, yes, obviously a character takes her own life in this play, and that is the inciting incident for the narrative that plays out. But it doesn't really deal with any of the complexities of suicide. Our knowledge and understanding of suicide, of taking your own life, and the mental health issues related to that have come along massively since this was written in 1945. Now, normally you cannot be held legally responsible for someone killing themselves. There is exceptions for assisting someone commit suicide. There's legal frameworks in place for people on the internet encouraging people to commit suicide. And there's also issues about duty of care. If there's somebody within your care who commits suicide, you could be liable for wrongful death. But broadly speaking, if a loved one, if someone you know, if a classmate commits suicide, you can't be held responsible for it. Whether you are morally responsible, again, could vary massively, but if someone commits suicide, it is usually not helpful to think, could I have done anything different that would have changed it? It's a very nuanced topic. It's one that I don't really have the space to go into here, but it never really gets covered at all because Priestley is using suicide as a shorthand for tragedy. He's not ready to go into some of the complexity surrounding suicide. So if you or anyone you know is dealing with suicidal thoughts, search for the National Suicide Prevention Helpline. Mind is brilliant as well. And lastly, the Samaritans are always free to call. So by all means, talk to people who know more about this than me. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get back to the play. So, in 1912, women were still not allowed to vote and had very little political power or influence, and we see that very much with Eva Smith here. She has very little power, even in her own life. Women were not paid as much as men, and lots of women were expected to give up employment when they were married. The idea being that if you believe a worker is going to go off and get pregnant at some point, then there's not really much point investing into them as a worker, as a manager. There's not much point promoting them because the idea is they will go off at some point. Now, this is obviously sexist. This is obviously a problem. Nowadays, this is illegal. And this is why I'm bringing up the fact that they don't have the ability to vote. If you can't vote, then you don't get a say in the laws governing your country. And that's why stuff like this is allowed to happen. Some women were born into lower class families and turned to prostitution to survive. For obvious reasons, we don't have any exact figures on the number of prostitutes or the women working in the sex industry in this time, but some estimates, for example, in London in the tail end of the Victorian era, would put it at about 80,000 women working in the sex industry around that time. So it is a widespread problem. And part of the reason it is a widespread problem is there's a lot of stigma surrounding being pregnant outside of marriage, and there is very little support. Raising a child is exhausting. It is a full-on, full-time job, and it is impossible to go out and earn a living at the same time. So if you're trying to do it on your own, it's damn near impossible. So this is why some women find themselves turning to prostitution, because they simply don't have any other choice. Now, at the start of this video, I said quite facetiously, what does J.B. Priestley get wrong about Eva Smith? And this is the point I'm getting at. On the one hand, An Inspector Calls could be seen as a feminist text because it follows the life of a working class woman, and it shows us the effects that society can have on somebody like this, and how this is, I wouldn't say it's never been talked about. It's the idea of a woman being vulnerable in society has almost sort of turned into a trope at this point, and it's something that comes back. It's a modern day equivalent of a damsel in distress. So you could see it as a feminist text in that respect. However, Eva Smith / Daisy Renton has no voice in this. She has to rely on a man to tell her story. We don't even hear her lines read out from her diary at any point. She is completely silent. She's completely reliant on other people and predominantly men to tell her story. If we compared this to something like 13 Reasons Why, which came out on Netflix a few years back, where that is a young girl who kills herself and then she effectively narrates her story through the tapes. That's almost like an updated version of An Inspector Calls. And Eva Smith has no voice. And not only that, she has no agency. Yes, obviously, she leads the strike, so she's not a completely passive character. But when bad things happen to her, she has very little ability to do anything about it. She's often presented as passive rather than active. There's the point after the affair with Gerald ends, and she has to leave the lodgings, and he gives her some money to sort of see her through to the end of the year. Now, if you think of that as she has some money to survive this time, that could give her time to find another job or find somewhere else to get work or any number of things, but she doesn't take that opportunity. She ends up going back into prostitution. Now, there could be reasons why that is. They're not presented, why she has to go back into prostitution. And you could argue that I'm victim blaming at this point. For me, I'm really just pointing out a slight weakness in the play, a slight, not plot hole as such, but something that hasn't been answered to my satisfaction, as it were. Some key quotes, I think, about Eva, not from Eva, because I've covered she doesn't say anything. There's this line where Eric says, "Is that why she committed suicide?" Now, this word committed has become a bit more problematic these days. Committed is a funny word. You commit a crime, and suicide isn't a crime, but in this time in 1912, it was. Now, even though it's not been a crime for several decades now, we still use this language, committed suicide. And what we're doing there is we are presenting people who commit suicide as being effectively criminals, which isn't really fair, especially when you consider the fact that suicide is usually seen as the worst possible symptom of a mental health crisis. So that's something to pick up on there. Now, not only that, but the method she uses to kill herself is interesting. The inspector tells us she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, burnt her inside out, of course. Now, Eva could have killed herself in any number of ways. Drinking disinfectant is really interesting. I mean, on a practical level, yes, it probably wouldn't be that difficult to get hold of, but I think on a symbolic level, it has something going on there. She's pregnant with Eric's baby. She's not happy about that. So disinfectant is traditionally associated with cleaning something out. And so it's almost like she's drinking the disinfectant to clean the baby out of her system, to clean Eric out of her system, to clean everything that the Birlings have done to her completely out of her, even if that means killing her. The desire to be rid of them is so overwhelming. Now look at this. Sheila says, if she'd been some plain, miserable little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it. But she was very pretty and could take care of herself. Now, we've talked about this in the Sheila episode, that Sheila associates being pretty with being self-reliant, being able to support yourself. However, in a lot of ways, Eva's looks are kind of one of the things that get her into even more trouble. By being pretty, that could be a contributing factor to what draws her into prostitution. It's certainly one of the things that draws old man Megati to her, and Eric and Gerald. So in many ways, being pretty isn't an asset in this world. It actually is more likely to make you vulnerable and make you a target to predatory men. So that's something to think about there. And this line from Mrs Birling, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Listen to what Mrs Birling says. A girl of that sort. Mrs Birling virtually never refers to Eva Smith by name. It's always a girl or girls of that class or that sort of thing. So what she's doing is she's trying to dehumanize it in this way. One key term I want you to think about is narrative construct. I say construct rather than character because she never actually has any lines of dialogue in the play. So she is not technically a character, even though this is very much her story. She's a narrative device Priestley uses to evoke sympathy, and personally speaking, I think he does a good job of it. Again, theatre directors, dramaturges, and just people putting on a play like myself have felt the need to visually display Eva Smith / Daisy Renton because it helps to evoke sympathy for her. So she is, in many productions, she may be a character on the cast list, but that's not what she is in the original play, in the original script. One could think of her as a composite character. So we don't know for certain that Eva Smith / Daisy Renton are actually the same woman. Remember, the inspector shows the picture at different times to different people. He never shows two people the same picture. So theoretically, you could all be talking about different women at different points. But what Priestley is doing is he's creating a composite character. He's showing how the upper class treat the lower class badly in a variety of different ways and contexts. I hope that's proved useful and that's given you something for your essays. Please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.